Okay, pretty sure we left off right here, Houston Amendments. In Chapter 12 is the Mechanical Administration section, and you'll notice that Section M1201.2 application, we have an amendment in this section that basically says that the administrative requirements of Chapter 1, the administrative provisions of the mechanical code shall also apply to the mechanical requirements of Chapters 12 through 23, as well as to the mechanical provisions of Chapter 24 of the IRC, or of this code. Probably should have said this code, but I think there's no real change. You can see that in the previous Houston Amendment, the same code amendment was in there. So there's no change to the code requirements. No changes to the code intent for that section or the next section for maintenance. There was a previous City Houston Amendment that struck the section or the last sentence to the maintenance section. And we didn't really have a justification for why that was struck. So we weren't able to justify striking it in the current code. So that previous Houston Amendment in M12023 is no longer striking the last sentence. All right, looks like I need to let somebody in. Yeah. Chapter 13 of the IRC talks about the general mechanical system requirements. And there is a Houston Amendment to M1305.1.3, appliances in attics. There was a previous City Houston Amendment that required the 350-pound access ladder to those particular attics that have equipment located in them, and that amendment was brought forward and incorporated into this particular section with very little changes. No change to the code requirement, no change to the previous code intent. So it shouldn't alter any construction requirements in the field. You should be, if you're used to using the previous IRC, you'll be used to using this 2015 for that particular code section. Appliances under floors, there was some previous amendments added to 1305.1.4 that increased the size associated with access for underfloor spaces. And those sections are already included in the 2015 code. So there was no reason to have that amendment because it's already in the code. As you can see in section M13051.1.4.3 electrical requirements, the previous City Houston code reference to the electrical code was brought forward, and so there's no changes to that particular code section either. In M1307.4.2 mechanical ventilation, there was some edits made to this particular code section, and a reference was added as a pointer to correlate with applicable requirements of other volumes of the Houston Construction Code. The code intent and code requirements don't really change. It's just pointing you to the correct location of the appropriate code. There was a Houston Amendment added to M1308.2, protection against physical damage. If you notice in the exception, there was an exception for cast iron piping. We wanted to make sure that black steel pipe was included because that exception applies to that particular type of piping material also. And it's an exception that has been used and allowed by the City of Houston for years. So it was just a matter of actually putting it in the code to clarify things. Chapter 14 is heating and cooling equipment and appliances. And the previous section of M1401.2 for access included a Houston amendment. That amendment was brought forward into the current 2015 code into the same section with no change at all. So there's no change to the previous code requirement or code intent for that particular item. And it's all talking about providing level service space at least 30 inches deep and 30 inches wide along all sides of appliances where access is required. So basically, if you have a piece of equipment that have access panels built onto them, then you also have to provide a flat level surface for the workman to work on. That's basically all it says. In M1411.3, condensate disposal, the previous City Houston amendment to that section was brought forward and included in M1411.3. It's the same section. The code wasn't really altered. It was had a couple of minor edits, but the changes don't change the code requirement or the code intent. So the requirements are still the same as it was previously. Let's see. There was a previous City Houston amendment exception to the maximum duct length in the IRC. It's omitted as the IRC 2015 model code already includes code provisions that now address dryer exhaust duct power ventilators. As you can see, this particular section 1502.4.4 dryer exhaust duct power ventilators was extensively updated by the model code, and you can see that by all this blue text. So now they're allowing these dryer exhaust ducts to use power ventilators to extend the length of the duct, where they didn't actually talk about those items in the past. So that's actually going to be a slight change, and it should allow for longer lengths of domestic dryer, where the dryers actually include those power ventilators. As you can see here in M1502.4.5 of the 2012 code, there was a Houston amendment that said an overall length as specified by a particular section exceeds 35 feet. The equivalent length of the exhaust duct shall be identified on a permanent label. Length identification is now located in M1502.4.6, not .5. And basically, it's saying that where the exhaust duct equivalent length exceeds 35 feet, the equivalent length of the exhaust duct shall be identified on a permanent label or tag, just like the previous code. So there's really no changes to the previous code requirements or code intent. If you're exceeding that 35 feet for the dryer duct length, then you just have to identify that on a label next to the dryer duct. The previous City Houston amendment for makeup air in section M1508.1 was brought forward, but it is now located in M1502.6, which is titled makeup air. And the requirements didn't change at all. It's the same requirements, but the previous amendment is retained to specifically address makeup air for dryer closets. The City Houston amendment is relocated in the new code, as I said, but the code requirements did not change. There was a Houston amendment in section M15032 of the 2012 code, and that was brought forward to the same section in the 2015 code with no changes, and you can see that in this particular code comparison. Let's get down to the next City Houston amendment. Chapter 16 is duct systems, and the previous City Houston amendment was omitted. This amendment is no longer needed as duct design requirements of SPACNA address the issue sufficiently. The list of duct system requirements has been revised to reference the applicable standards and delete redundant language. The table for material thickness of metal ducts was replaced with what is currently consistent with the SMACNA sheet metal construction standard. So essentially, the model code is being used in this case, and we didn't really need to include this previous strikeout because it's already sufficiently addressed in the current codes. You can see that they added this table, M1601.1.1, duct construction minimum sheet metal thickness. So now there's this table in there that goes into a lot more details about the thicknesses of duct, which comes straight out of the SMACNA standards. As you can see in the previous code, there was a table for gauges of metal ducts. Well, that got completely replaced by this new table. There was a City of Houston amendment in M1601.4.3 for supports, which identified certain size requirements for the metal straps and galvanized wire at certain intervals. And now the model code basically requires you to comply with the SMACNA rules for those same requirements. And that should help these mechanical installers because they're already familiar with SMACNA anyway. So if they know the SMACNA rules and requirements, they can just completely follow those and not have to worry about violating an IRC requirement. Again, this is one of those sections, M1601.4.9, that talks about flood hazard areas, and there was a previous pointer to the city code, which was retained and brought forward into the new code, but is now located in 1601.4.10. So the code section just changed a little bit, but the intent and the requirements did not change at all. There's a new City of Houston amendment in section 1602.2, return air openings, that is in item 2 of this section. Basically, it says return air openings for heating, ventilation, or air conditioning systems shall comply with all of the following. And item 2 says the amount of return air taken from any room with a door installed that confines the room or space shall be not greater than the flow rate of the supply air delivered to such room or space. So the provisions of this section was relocated from the same section or number in 2012 IRC, but was extensively updated in the 2015 code. In addition, a City Houston amendment was added to provide additional clarity. The provisions for return air have been simplified and clarified to improve understanding while preserving the intent of keeping contaminants out of the airstream of the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. The provisions for outdoor air openings have been removed, and the code now references the applicable provisions for outdoor air in Chapter 3. So essentially, there's not supposed to be any technical changes to the code. The Houston Amendment was just to add a little bit more clarity to try to make it easier for customers and plant analysts and inspectors to know what to put out in the code or know what to see out in the field. In section M1603.1, central vacuum systems, there was a Houston amendment in the previous code. We brought that same code requirement forward into the new code. There's no changes made to that particular amendment. And so everyone hopefully is familiar with that. It basically says ducts used in central vacuum cleaning systems within a dwelling unit shall be permitted to be of PVC pipe. Penetrations of firewalls, rated floor ceiling assemblies, or rated floor ceiling assemblies, rated floor ceiling, or rated floor ceiling assemblies shall comply with this code. Copper and ferrous pipes or conduits shall be used to extend through the wall assembly, separation between a garage and a dwelling unit for a central vacuum unit. So there's no change to that previous code requirement. There was a previous Houston amendment that struck out a reference to the International Fuel and Gas Code and it also struck out the word international in front of the fire code and building code. That was not struck out in the current code, and it's mainly because the definitions applied are in the chapter 2 specifically identify what it means when you read the words International Fuel Gas Code or any of the codes referenced where it's using the word international. Basically, what the definition says is anywhere that the code references the international, any of the international code, it's talking about the Houston adopted code. Chapter 22 is for special piping and storage systems. Section 2201.1 had a previous Houston Amendment note that said all special pipe and storage systems shall conform to Chapter 57 of the Fire Code. That same Houston Amendment was brought forward and is included in the 2015 code in the same section. No change to the code requirements or the code intent. In section G2401, which is for fuel gas, the application section, the previous City of Houston Amendment was brought forward. There's a minor change to a couple of sections, but it didn't change, that particular change doesn't change the code intent or code requirements associated with anything that have to do with fuel gas. So basically whatever was applicable before is applicable now in the 2015 code. We changed and updated references to certain chapters and sections so that it's correct to the current code chapters and sections that apply, and but the code requirements don't change. Again, section G2404.7 of the previous code and the current code have to do with flood hazard areas and just have a pointer to the city code chapter 19. No change to the code requirements or code intent. There was a City of Houston amendment under prohibited locations that struck 2 of the listed items, and we brought that same Houston amendment forward with no changes other than just bringing it forward. So the same 2 items that were struck previously are struck in the new code. There was a section G2411.1.1 that addresses CSST, corrugated stainless steel tubing, and there was a section added or a sentence added to that that basically said corrugated stainless steel gas piping systems shall be bonded per the manufacturer's installation instructions. The City of Houston Amendment was omitted as the model code specifically requires compliance with the manufacturer's installation requirements in every application. So it was felt that we didn't need to add a City of Houston Amendment to this section where it was already addressed. So that previous City of Houston Amendment was eliminated. There's no change to the code requirements or the code intent that have to do with corrugated stainless steel tubing. The previous City of Houston Amendment in the 12th Code for liquefied petroleum gas was brought forward with no changes. Let this person in real quick. And that was in section G2412.2. As you can see, when it's grayed out like that, that means the Houston Amendment did not change. It just came forward just as is. Same thing in the very next section that talks about sizing for gas piping. The previous City of Houston Amendment was just brought forward, and there's no change to the code requirements or the code intent. Section G2413.6 was struck in the 2012 code, and the same section in the 2015 code was struck also. We just brought that City of Houston Amendment forward. So there should be no change to the code requirements or code intent that applied that were addressed by that section. metallic fittings. There was a previous City Houston amendment under metallic fittings, number 3, that says brass or bronze fittings, if exposed to soil, should have a minimum 80% copper content. That same code requirement and Houston amendment was brought forward into the 2015 code. And as you can see, there's a lot of blue. So the model code actually expanded to include an additional item listed in this particular section. So it says now, where pipe fittings are drilled and tapped in the field, the operation shall be in accordance with all the following. And then it lists a whole list of 5 items that everybody's going to have to comply with if you're drilling and tapping fittings in the field. In G2415-6, the previous City of Houston amendment was brought forward. There's some minor editorial changes to delete requirements that are already included in other volumes of the Houston Construction Code, so it wasn't felt that it was needed to be duplicated in the IRC. The extended text of the previous City of Houston amendment is no longer needed as specific details are identified in HPC handouts. In other words, there's several handouts that the Houston Permitting Center provides that already address certain things that are identified in this previous code section, so it wasn't necessary. The next 2 sections, protection against corrosion and individual outside appliance. There's 2 City of Houston amendments that was in the previous code that were brought forward. No changes to those particular requirements. So the intent should remain the same. The application should remain the same. And that also applies to G2415.17.1 limitations for plastic pipe. The previous City of Houston amendment included a dimension for a minimum depth of 18 inches of coverage, which you'd think is a typical coverage requirement for all gas piping, but apparently if you don't mention it, someone will not bury it as deep as it's supposed to be. Here's a previous City of Houston amendment for inspections that was brought forward. There's a couple of minor editorial changes that was made by the legal department, but it doesn't really change the code requirements or the code intent. It has to do with rough-end inspections and final inspections and what to expect from both of those types of inspections from the field inspectors. So those requirements are not changed. In section G2417.4 test pressure measurement, there's a new sentence at the end of this section. It was modified for clarity and to include provisions for an alternative measuring device. So basically, the last sentence now says test gauges shall have a pressure range not greater than twice the pressure applied. And then at the beginning of the sentence, it says test pressure shall be measured with a nanometer or with an approved alternative. So if you happen to have a nanometer to test your pressure and you have something else that can provide an equivalency to that, you can talk to the field inspectors and get permission from one of their seniors or supervisors to use that alternative device to test the pressure. Again, G2417.4.1 goes into more detail about the test pressure requirements. And the previous City of Houston amendment was brought forward to the 2015 code. And you'll notice that it's worded a little differently. I mean, really it just has numbers instead of letters under 3, But other than that, it's exactly the same as it was before. So there shouldn't be any change to how you guys do business out in the field when you're trying to get your pressure tests done. Same thing applies to G2418-2. There was a minor previous City Houston amendment that was brought forward to the new code. Same thing goes with the very next section for sediment traps. There was a previous City Houston amendment that struck a few of the words out of the model code text. That same text was struck out of the 2015 model code. In section G2423.1, there was a previous Houston amendment that addressed CNG fuel and other operations, and that same information or that same amendment was brought forward and basically says that it has to comply in accordance with the fire code, whatever those requirements are. But it has to do with motor fuel dispensing facilities for CNG fuel and their operation shall be in accordance with the fire code. There's no change to the Houston code requirements. I don't really know anybody with a residence that would have something like this, but I guess it's possible. Appliances not required to be vented. There's a Houston amendment that was in the previous code. That amendment was brought forward. It eliminates item 7 out of this model code text. And there's no change to the previous Houston amendment or the code intent. Back down. Specific lengths, where are we at? The maximum length of exhaust duct shall be 35 feet. Here it looks like we're back in dryer duct vents. Yeah. And there's an exception that says listed booster fans installed per manufacturer specification may be provided to extend the maximum length of the exhaust duct. We talked about that earlier. There's another section that goes into even more detail about manufacturer's requirements and lengths. But the previous City Houston amendment exception was maintained and brought forward into the new 2015 code. Again, in G2439.5.6, there was a previous Houston amendment that had an overall length as specified in a particular section exceeds 35 feet, and then it goes into some requirements on what the requirements would be, and that one requirement is to be identified on a permanent label or tag. Those same requirements are brought forward into the 2015 code. So there's no change to the previous code requirements or Houston amendments. Unvented room heaters. There was a previous amendment in G2445.1 that basically said unvented fuel burning room heaters and decorative appliances shall be prohibited. That same section was brought forward to the 2015 code, but now it's worded a little bit differently. It says prohibited fuel burning room heaters and decorative appliances is the title. Unvented fuel burning room heaters and decorative appliances shall be prohibited. The remainder of this section remains the same as the model code. There's no change to the previous code requirements or code intent. With new technology coming out, I can see this Houston Amendment going away at some point in the future. Maybe that can be something that we can all discuss when we're going through the code development process to update to the 2021 codes. In G2447.2 prohibited locations, there was a previous City Houston amendment that was brought forward. Only now that particular section also includes an exception that was added by the model code. The exception says appliances that are also listed as domestic cooking appliances. So basically it's saying that cooking appliances designated, tested, listed, and labeled for use in commercial appliances or commercial occupancies shall only be installed within dwelling units or within an area where domestic cooking operations occur when in compliance with the ventilation and clearance to combustible requirements for commercial cooking appliances in the mechanical code. And of course, there's this exception. This is something else that might be changed in the future. I know that there are some issues with commercial appliances being used in residential occupancies because the commercial appliances don't include certain safety features that residential appliances do include for the protection of the occupants of the residence. And allowing commercial appliances in a residence, unless they're specifically built to meet those other standards, could be a problem and cause some injuries. So we probably want to look at that next time again. Rough plumbing. In the 2012 code, there was no amendment to the rough plumbing section. There is a City of Houston amendment that was added to eliminate unnecessary text and to ensure that the DWV systems are installed and tested in accordance with the minimum city standards and typical plumbing installation requirements. So that's why you see some of this modified. Let's see. There was a modification done to section P2603.2.1, protection against physical damage, which for piping installed through bored holes or in notches, the minimum clearance distance from the concealed piping to the edge of the framing member has been reduced from 1.5 inches to 1.25 inches. Protection is required for piping installed less than 1.25 inches from the edge of the framing members. So as long as you have the depth that you need to have more than 1.25 inches, you wouldn't necessarily have to provide this protection on the front. You can see this example down here where this pipe is going through the plates, and they have to put a steel plate in front of that to prevent someone from driving a nail or screwing into that pipe. You can see them through all of these locations here. But if you have enough depth, you wouldn't necessarily have to deal with that. General, shower compartments shall have not less than 1,000 square inches. That Houston amendment that was in the 2012 code was brought forward to the 2015 code, along with the other two amendments that were in exceptions 1 and 2. There's no change to the code requirements or the code intent for these particular code provisions. So it should be the same as it was previously. There was a Houston amendment added to section P2708.2 for shower drains. And now it's the size of not less than 2 inches in diameter. The amendment was added to correlate with the minimum requirements of the Houston plumbing code. So this is one of those situations where the residential code was a little different from the Houston plumbing code, and we needed to correlate those two. There was a previous City of Houston amendments provided for P27095 test for shower receptors. That previous Houston amendment was brought forward with no changes. So there's no change to the code requirements or the code intent for that particular issue. There was a previous Houston amendment in 2717.3 for sink, dishwasher, and food grinders that struck some text. And that text, that amendment was renumbered and relocated, no changes to the code requirements or code intent. So instead of it being in section 2717.3, it's now in 2717.1 and 2. But it doesn't really change the code requirements. They're the same. There's a Houston amendment to section P2725 that addressed non-liquid saturated treatment systems. That entire section was deleted and reserved. The City of Houston amendment was added, eliminating these new model code provisions to comply with local requirements. So apparently you can't do these anyway. All right, section 2801 through 2801.6.1 have Houston amendments that address specific things. The code now specifically requires drain valves and a threaded outlet for water heaters. The water heater pan requirements have been expanded to accept aluminum and plastic pans of the prescribed thickness. The code clarifies that a pan drain is not required when a water heater is replaced and there is no existing drain. The model code was expanded to include addition code clarification and guidance. A City of Houston amendment was added to provide additional clarity and to identify that listed pans should be used where they are available. Where allowed, new code text addresses minimum requirements for the use of plastic pans. The model code was modified to include additional clarity. A City of Houston amendment was added to address local requirements for installations. The previous editions of the code did not specifically require drain valves or water heaters, although manufacturers do provide such drains on storage tank type water heaters. The International Plumbing Code has required a drain valve at the bottom of each tank type water heater and hot water storage tank, but stated that the drain valve had to comply with the reference standard. The standard has been discontinued and has been removed from the 2015 IPC. And of course, we adopt the UPC. Both codes now prescribe drain valves with inlets of not less than 3/4 inch nominal iron pipe size and outlets provided with male hose threads to connect a garden hose. Water heater drain valves are necessary to drain water heaters for replacement or maintenance. Safety pans are required under storage type tank water heaters if a leak in the tank will cause damage. Previously, the code prescribed 24 gauge galvanized steel pans or other pans approved by the building official. Aluminum and plastic water heater pans are common in the marketplace and are installed across states. The intent of the expanded products that are widely accepted in the marketplace. So hopefully that'll give everyone more options when picking pans for their water heaters, and that'll help. Let's see. Requirements for discharge pipe. There was a previous City of Houston amendment to item 5 of this section, and that same amendment was brought forward, but there was some additional items added to this code in the model code, and one of them is item 14. That particular item was deleted. The model code was relocated from IRC 2803.6.1 to P2804.6.1. And it was expanded to include additional details in item number 10 and includes the addition of one item on the list of requirements, number 14. The previous City of Houston amendment was retained and expanded to delete the newly added requirement, number 14. No changes to the code requirements or code intent from the previous code is anticipated. The temperature and pressure relief valve discharge pipe termination must have an air gap suitable to protect the potable water supply distribution system of the building. PEX and PE-RT tubing used for relief valve discharge piping must be one size larger than the TMP valve discharge outlet, and the outlet end of the tubing must be fastened in place. So these are some of the things that got expanded by the international code, and it includes some details, some drawings you might want to take a look at on here to hopefully help give you a little more understanding of what they're talking about. Let's go down to the next amendment. Connections to boilers. The previous City of Houston amendment is modified for clarity only and was brought forward. There were no changes to the code requirements or code intent for this particular section. In section P2902.5.5 for solar systems, there was some text eliminated out of that particular section. And then the exception included an editorial strike, and those particular amendments was not brought forward to the same section in the 2015 code. The model code provisions extensively for solar thermal systems, heating, potable water distribution systems, and the City of Houston was omitted for model code provisions because they sufficiently address all the requirements. So they cleaned up the code sections, and there was no need to make that change. The model code also added a new section called direct systems for other than potable water distribution systems. And ICC modified the model code provisions extensively for solar thermal systems and heating potable water distribution systems. The City of Houston amendment was added to correlate with local policy. So there was a City of Houston amendment that struck with an intermediate atmospheric vent complying with ASCE 1016. Only that was struck out of that. And if you notice, that's the same text that was in the previous code section, but it was in a different code section. So because ICC expanded this particular code requirements, the previous Houston amendment sort of got split up amongst the sections, but the requirements did not change. There's a Houston amendment that was in the previous code for maximum flow rates and consumption for plumbing fixtures and fixture fittings that got brought forward into the current code without change. There was some additional modification amendments added to one of the footnotes for clarity. It didn't change the code requirements. It's just hopefully help to clarify what the code requirements actually are. And it has to do with a handheld shower spray. The word shall be considered was struck, and now it says is also a shower head. So it just clarifies that the handheld shower is also considered a shower head. Previous City of Houston amendment to section 29041 was brought forward. That amendment deleted the text that says that backflow preventers shall not be required to separate a standalone sprinkler system from the water distribution center system. There's a City of Houston requirement that our potable water system has to be protected from all these types of possible contaminations. Sprinkler systems are one of them. P29043 includes a Houston amendment, the model code added an exception to the provisions of this section. City legal added a City Houston amendment eliminating passive or permissive language and clarifying the code requirements. So it shouldn't actually change the code requirements. It's intended to just eliminate permissive language and be more clear. Basically, the exception says for plastic piping, it shall be required to follow either the manufacturer's installation instructions or the provisions of this code, whichever is more restrictive. Let those guys in, okay, go back. Excuse me. Section 29058, joint and connection tightness. There was a previous City Houston amendment that said no joint shall be permitted under slabs. That same Houston amendment was brought forward, but is now located in 2906.8. No change to the code requirements or code intent. There was a Houston Amendment added to Section 2906.5 that addressed cross-linking ethylene plastic, or PEX. The provisions of this section in the model code was relocated from IRC Section 2905.9.1.4. And the City of Houston Amendment was added for clarity and to coordinate with other relocated and renumbered sections. So essentially, we updated the sections in this particular code section to correlate with other code provisions to make sure that you got to the right code sections. And what happens is, when amendments get added to certain other sections, it changes the numbers of the following sections. So then we have to update those sections in other code provisions like this one to make sure that you find what you're looking for when it's referencing a particular section. There is a Houston Amendment that was added to address resistance from possible degradation of PEX plastic materials due to being exposed to chlorine and certain temperatures. So now there's a Houston Amendment in section 2906.9.1.5.3 that address tubing. It says PEX tubing shall have a minimum chlorine designation code of 5 to meet minimum chlorine resistance at in-use condition of 100% of the time at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Acceptable markings on the tubing are PEX 5106, PEX 5206, and PEX 5306. I'm pretty sure this amendment was added at the request of some stakeholders. I don't remember if it was an amendment that was proposed by the plumbing department. I seem to recall this being one that was proposed by one of our stakeholder members that knew a lot about this tubing material and chlorine issues that are associated with it. There was a previous City of Houston amendment in P2905.17.2. That amendment was brought forward with no changes, so there's no change to the previous code requirements or the code intent for that particular item. There's a new code provision added to 2910-1, and the City of Houston Amendment was added for clarity and to correlate with state law and TCEQ rules. And this has to do with non-power systems and Texas Commission on Environmental Quality for potable water systems. And basically, the amendment just says the provisions of either this section or the rules promulgated by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, whichever is more restrictive, shall apply. And we're moving to Chapter 30, Sanitary Drains. There was a previous City of Houston amendment for flood-resistant installation that was brought forward for 3001.3 and 3002.3.1. There was a previous City of Houston amendment that was also brought forward to allow cast iron or black. Instead of just calling it black, the more appropriate name, according to the plumbers, is to refer to it as cast iron. Let's see. There's a Houston amendment added to solvent cementing sections under P3003.9. Sorry. Admit all. The application of a primer to drain waste and vent PVC pipe and fittings prior to solvent cement is not required for 4-inch pipe size and smaller, provided that the piping is for a non-pressure application. Minor editorial changes were added as a City of Houston amendment, deletes the exception, allowing the elimination of cement primers. So that means that the you will have to have primers, or you will continue to have primers for PVC applications, just to make sure that it's clean and that the glue is bonding like it's supposed to be. There's a section for fittings for change in direction. There's a table that had some previous City Houston amendments. Those same Houston amendments was brought forward and was modified slightly to correlate with the Houston Plumbing Code. So this table now correlates better with certain provisions of the Houston Plumbing Code, which you have to comply with anyway. So hopefully that will help clarify certain installations out in the field. Cleanouts required. This section P3005.2, cleanouts has been completely reorganized and reworded for clarity by the model code. Brass cleanout plugs are only permitted for metal piping. Where located at a finish wall, the cleanout must be within 1.5 inches of the finished surface. A cleanout is no longer required at the base of each waste or soil stack. A City of Houston amendment was added to IRC P3005.2.1 to correlate with the Houston Plumbing Code, section 719.4. There's no real change to the previous code technical requirements or code intent. Hopefully these changes that were added to this particular section will help clarify what the requirements are and include certain requirements that come from the plumbing code so that you don't get crossed up out in the field after the fact. There was a City of Houston amendment added to section 3005.2.8 installation arrangement of a cleanout to correlate with the Houston Plumbing Code section 719.4 also. The City of Houston change eliminates test tees as cleanouts. So this amendment was necessary to maintain consistency with the Houston Plumbing Code requirements. In section 3005.4.1, there was a previous City of Houston amendment in that same section that got brought forward. And then the Houston amendment was modified to eliminate section exception 2. The technical code requirements didn't change and the code intent didn't change for this particular section. Sewage backflow. Model code added a new exception to this section for existing buildings where fixtures that are located above the next upstream manhole cover are allowed to discharge through a back water valve. A City of Houston amendment deletes this exception to correlate with provisions in the Houston Plumbing Code. You can see here where the City of Houston deleted the exception, and there's no change to the previous code requirements or code intent. So it should be business as usual in the field. Gray water recycling systems, section 3009.1. A City of Houston amendment was added to correlate with state TCEQ rules for installations of gray water systems. Basically, the amendment is just a reference to the appropriate Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and it says whichever one's more restrictive, the code or the TCEQ rules, those are the ones that apply. Previous Houston amendments that was located in section P3114.3 and P3114.4 were both brought forward with no changes. So there are no changes to code requirements or code intent for either of those two sections. Chapter 32 is traps. Let's go down. The first section that the Houston amended is table P3201.7. There was some previous Houston amendments in that table. Those amendments was brought forward, and then there was a change to or in addition to that Houston Amendment that updates the flow rate requirements for 5.7 gallons per minute or less shower heads to correlate with the Houston Plumbing Code. There are no, other than that one addition, there are no changes to the code requirements for this particular code section. Okay, we're moving on to a code requirement under electrical part 7 or part 8 of the IRC, which is the electrical provisions. And the previous City Houston Amendment was brought forward, which basically just says delete chapters 34 through 43 in their entirety, and electrical has to be done per the NEC, just like any other electrical. No changes to the Houston code requirements. In Chapter 44, the reference standards list, there were several standards that were updated or added to this list to be more up to date. One was identifying the current 2020 NEC instead of the 2014, because the 2015 IRC references the 2014 edition, and we're under the 2020 edition. Another standard that was updated is NFPA 241 was updated to the 2019 edition. Standard for safeguarding construction, alteration, and demolition operations. That particular standard was updated in all of the City Houston codes to that edition of NFPA 241. There was a City Houston amendment that added E90, the 2016 edition. That's a standard test method for laboratory measurement of airborne sound transmission loss of building partitions and elements. That was the only 3 standards that got modified in the standards list. Let's see, in the appendices, Appendix A of the 2012 code was adopted. Appendix A of the 2015 code was adopted. That appendix is sizing and capacities of gas piping. There's no change to the code requirements or code intent. We just adopt that appendix straight up. Appendix B of the 2012 IRC was adopted. That has to do with sizing and venting of venting systems serving appliances equipped with draft hoods. That same appendix in the 2015 IRC is adopted also. No change to the code requirements other than whatever is in the model code for that IRC appendix. I don't remember there actually being any changes, but I'll have to double check on that. Appendix C, exit terminal of mechanical draft and direct venting systems. That's Appendix C of the 2012 code was adopted with that same appendix in the 2015 code with no changes to that appendix. In the 2012 code, Appendix H was adopted, which is patio covers. We adopt that same appendix in the IRC 2015 code. There are no changes to the appendix in that appendix. Let's see. Appendix K, sound transmission, is adopted in the 2012 code. It's also adopted in the 2015 code. Sound transmission was not adopted in the 2012 code, but it is adopted in the 2015 code. There are some minor changes to that appendix, and those happen in Appendix AK, Section AK 101.1. And it basically says, the Houston Amendment says, wall and floor ceiling assembly separating dwelling units in multifamily residential structures. It does not address, or this appendix does not apply to dwelling, single 1 or 2 family dwellings, which includes duplexes. It only applies to townhouses that include 3 or more dwelling units, attached dwelling units. No other changes were made to that appendix. let's see, Appendix L. No changes were made to the City of Houston Amendment for Appendix L, but the entire appendix was replaced with the following. Basically light frame conventional construction. And this particular appendix can be used as one of the 6 options if your wind speed for your particular area exceeds 140 miles per hour. But like we talked about earlier, you're probably not going to run into any that exceed 140 mile per hour in the Houston area, at least. There was some minor updates for clarification. As you can see, these green words or highlighted words are the changes that apply. Appendix M, home daycare, was adopted in the 2015 code. Like I said earlier, that was specifically requested by the Houston Fire Department. So when you're submitting your plans to the plan analyst, even though it might be a single family residence, if you're intending on using your house for a home daycare facility, you're going to want to identify that specific use on the use line to let them know. Because what will happen is if you build a brand new house and then the fire marshal goes out later and they happen to find out that you're using it for a home daycare facility and it was built to the 2015 code, then they're going to make you come back and update your structure to comply with this appendix, because the facility should have been constructed to meet these requirements. So I know that not everybody knows what they're going to use their house for, and things change over time, and that's fine. That can happen. It's just a matter of when you decide to change your single family residence to a home daycare, then you would have to come back and submit plans to upgrade certain things to comply with this Appendix M requirement. And then you would get a CC, a certificate of compliance, that specifically indicates that home is being approved for use as a home daycare also. Appendix Q, as I mentioned earlier, is the airport sound attenuation requirements. Previously, it was located in Appendix M of the IRC, and as you can see, there's not very much change to it. Most of these changes have to do with correcting the right appendix letter and identifying certain sections that are different than what it was previously. As far as the code requirements, they're all typically the same. There's no changes to the technical code requirements or code intent. These updates are just identifying the appropriate code sections that you want to comply with to meet these requirements. Appendix T was adopted in the IRC. The Appendix T has to do with tiny houses, and you're not going to find this text in the 2015 model code. Tiny houses didn't go into the code until I think the 2018 code, and we actually had to go out to the 2018 IRC and bring that code section back to the 2015 code as an amendment. So that's why you'll see this entire appendix is an amendment in the 2015 codes, because we had to bring that from the 15 code. You can see that building a house to tiny house code provisions is not the same as building to the IRC general requirements. This tiny house appendix is specific to houses that are 400 square feet in area or less. And it specifically identifies what you can do in that 400 square foot tiny house for certain building elements. For example, you know, the scope says the appendix shall be applicable to tiny houses used for single-family dwelling units. Tiny houses shall comply with this code except as otherwise stated in the appendix. So it offers these definitions: egress, roof access window, landing platform, loft, tiny house. A dwelling that is 400 square feet or less in floor area, excluding lofts. Egress roof access window, a skylight or roof window designed and installed to satisfy the emergency escape and rescue opening requirements of section R310.2. Landing platform, a landing provided as the top step of a stairway accessing a loft. Ceiling heights. You can see here the minimum ceiling height. Habitable space in the hallways in tiny houses shall have a ceiling height of not less than 6 foot 8 inches. Bedrooms, toilet rooms, and kitchens shall have a ceiling height of not less than 6 foot 4 inches. Obstructions, including but not limited to beams, girders, ducts, and lighting, shall not extend below these minimum ceiling heights. And then, of course, there's an exception. Ceiling heights in lofts are permitted to be less than 6 feet 8 inches. And typically what we're seeing in these tiny houses is, you know, they have a very small living room, and then the loft, what they're calling the loft, is really, it's just like a bed, it's a shelf up above the living area that is used as a bed. And then there's a window over top of it, an egress roof access window above the top of it. And here you go, it says lofts. Minimum loft area and dimensions. A loft used as a sleeping or living space shall meet the minimum area and dimension requirements of sections 104.1.1 through 104.1.3. Minimum area is 35 square feet. Minimum dimension is not less than 5 feet in any horizontal dimension. Height effect on loft area. Portions of a loft with a sloping ceiling measuring less than 3 feet from the finished floor to the finished ceiling shall not be considered as contributing to the minimum required area of the loft. Exceptions. Portions of a loft with a sloped ceiling measuring less than 16 inches from the finished floor to the finished ceiling located under a gable roof with a minimum slope of 6 units vertical and 12 units horizontal, 50% slope, shall not be considered as contributing to the minimum required area of the loft. Loft access to the primary egress from loft shall be of any type described in sections AT 104.2.1 through 104.2.4. Stairways accessing loft shall comply with this code. The width. Stairway width accessing the loft shall not be less than 17 inches in clear width at or above the handrail. The width below the handrail should be not less than 20 inches. Headroom. The headroom in stairways accessing the loft shall not be less than 6'2", as measured vertically from a sloped line connecting the tread or landing platform nosings in the middle of their width. Treads and risers. Accessing the loft shall not be less than 7 inches and not more than 12 inches in height. So you can see that, you know, building a stair is a little bit different in these tiny houses. Each little thing that's associated with these tiny houses has their own requirements, and if it's not specifically identified in this appendix, then it falls back to base code requirements. Appendix U is adopted. Appendix U is the Soda Riley provisions for detached 1 and 2 family dwellings. The appendix is adopted in its entirety, and it only has one Houston amendment, and that's the amendment for U-103-6, which basically says conduit not less than 1 1/4 inches shall be installed to provide a pathway from the electrical panel to the underside of the roof sufficient to allow future installation of solar equipment. In Appendix V was adopted by the City of Houston in the 15 code, which is visitability. As you can see, there's not any changes. There were some additions to include metric system for certain dimensions that were identified. Those same dimensions were identified previously in the other code. For some reason in the 15 code, some of those metric equivalents were not included, and city legal likes to be consistent. So that's why you see those added. There were previous minimum clear width for single wheelchairs under this appendix. Those same details are included in the current code. That gets us all the way through the 325 Houston amendments to the IRC. So let's see, we have about 15 minutes, I guess, to go. So I'll be happy to go back and try to answer a few questions. Let's see, chat. If anyone can put in the chat a question they might have, I'll be happy to try to answer it for you. There's a lot of chat stuff, so if I scroll all the way back up, let's see, let's see if I can find a question. Okay. Yeah. Let's try again. Let me put my email address in case someone wants to send in a question. Just to let everybody that's attending know, we have another of these presentations planned. It's coming up. Let's see. Let me look. I think it's next week. Let's see. Next Monday at 10 a.m. and it'll be 3 hours long also. It'll be for the IBC. And then probably within a couple of weeks after that, we'll do one more for the existing building code. We're doing the existing building code now internally. As soon as we finish up those training classes for the plan analysts and the inspectors, we're going to turn right back around and do that for every. I don't want anyone to sign out yet because we still got about 11 minutes that we have to meet to get the 3-hour CEU. So I'm giving everyone the opportunity to ask a question if you have one. I just got a question that says, is a home daycare compliant with the new IRC regulations required to be submitted to the Planning Commission? You know, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know that it has to be provided to the Planning Commission, but that's a really good question. You know, it doesn't change the occupancy classification. The intent is the home daycare, it's still an R3 occupancy group. It's just being used for home daycare. And I know there's a limit. I think it's 5 minimum or 5 maximum children or something to that effect. That allows the occupancy group to be maintained as an R3. So because it's the same occupancy group, my first impulse would be to say, I don't see why it would have to go through the planning department, the planning commission. But I will double check with them and just ask them in case there's some kind of city ordinance that has some kind of specific requirement that's other than the building code that might require you to have to submit. So I'll get to you guys. Everyone that was on this meeting today, we'll make sure that we send that question out along with the answer that we get. Thanks for asking that question. There's another question asking if floodplain management and tiny homes, any special requirements if located in the A or V zones. The construction requirements of the tiny home specific to the inside of that building is addressed in the appendix. But if you're located in a flood zone or in a floodway where the flood chapter 19 of the flood ordinance would apply, you would still have to comply with all of their elevation requirements that's associated with the flood ordinances. So are there other requirements that are not mentioned in the appendix? Yes. You might have to elevate one of those tiny homes. You would, and if you have to do that, then you also have to elevate any equipment that's serving those homes, just like you would if it was a regular full-size building. Getting close. 1252. Like I said, these documents, and I'm sure you noticed as I was going through here, include a lot of other stuff. I mean, they really do. They include all of the significant changes from the ICC, as well as the Houston amendments. So they're very useful at finding changes to the 15 codes from the 2012 codes. I got an email that says, can you go more in depth on the solar rated provisions drawing requirements when submitting plans to City of Houston? We issued a code word recently that might help. Let me see if I can pull that up. Let's see. Okay, well, this is the code word, but there was something else we did, and that's what I want to show you. Let's see. Where is that thing? Let's see. Solar guide. Let's see. Tesla solar ready shingles. See if it's in here. That's not it. Let me see where it would be. Drawings. We just did a solar, here it is, an example. This is what I want to watch. This went out recently. Which is basically an example of what they're sort of looking for in plan review for on the roof layout plan or the site plan. And you can see here that, you know, Maher did a really nice job at putting together this little drawing that shows the requirements from 270 north to 110 north, and then any plane that is of a certain square footage that is facing anywhere in that direction has to provide the solar ready. And that's what he's showing here. He's showing you in the hash that this is the plane of the roof that's facing into this particular direction. And because of that, now a solar ready zone has to be shown on the plans along with the conduit that goes under the roof over to the electrical panel. So if, and then of course, you could fill in, you have to fill in the roof dead load and the roof live load, not the proposed for the solar, just whatever the minimum code required roof dead load and roof live load is required from the IRC is what has to be shown on that sheet, whether it's the site plan or whether it's a roof plan layout, whatever it might be. But this is just one example. You can include the notes that's required by that particular appendix, Appendix U. This code word goes into some details about, you know, what are we actually expected to see on the site plan or the roof plan. And he took the requirements identified in this code word and basically tried to give an example of what might be on a particular plan sheet that's included with the drawings. And this is what we came up with. Let's see. That's right. It's residential drawing number 22-01-R. This is available on our website. It's also, you know, anybody can get you a copy of it if you need it to help give you a better understanding of what plan review should be looking for. And I can't think of anything that is not shown in this code word or on this drawing that you would have to add to a plan for solar ready. I mean, you know, this particular plan might be the site plan. So obviously, if you're using your site plan to show your solar ready zones, your site plan is going to have everything else it's supposed to have on it for all the other departments that look at a site plan, location on property, things like that. But as far as the solar ready zone is concerned, the items shown on this example should be all the things that the plan analyst should be asking you to provide, nothing more. I hope that's helpful. We can certainly get you copies of these documents if you need them. You know, just shoot me an email, me or Heath, either one, and we can get you either one of these documents. We also recently updated a new guideline for solar submittals. That guideline applies to plans that are having to be submitted for review for solar installations. At some point in the near future, the city of Houston is working to have a pilot program to start utilizing this feature or this app called Solar App Plus that was produced by the Department of Energy. And as soon as we get all the modifications completed to the iPermits portal and then have it fully tested, I think we got one more meeting with the solar app people to talk about maybe having a few of the City of Houston amendments added to their app before we actually offer it for use as a pilot program to see if we can issue permits without having to go through plan review for solar installations for these typical cookie cutter type solar installations on existing buildings. I think the idea is that, you know, 85% of the solar installations will be able to utilize the solar app. And the way it works is you download the solar app to your phone or whatever, you go through the process of completing the questionnaire in the solar app program. It gives you an approval number, and it also issues you a checklist and a couple of other documents that go with the approval number, and then you upload those documents and that approval number to the iPermits portal under the one-stop plan review portion, and then you would be allowed to purchase your structural solar permit online without having to submit plans other than having to upload the documents provided by the solar app. Then at some point, the electrician goes to buy his permit. He would have to upload the one-line diagram to that same application, and he would be able to buy his electrical permit online without having to submit any other documents for review through the plan review process. So hopefully, you know, we get at any given time, there's about 250 to 300 solar projects going through our system. And if we could reduce 85% of those to online permits, that should be a really good service to our customers, so they wouldn't have to wait, you know, 3 to 4 weeks for a plan review. Okay, we're a little bit past 1 o'clock, so we've all met the time requirements. You feel free to log off, and I hope to see you guys at the next week's meeting. Thanks a lot again for participating today. I really appreciate y'all taking the time to try to understand our codes. Thank you.